It was the summer of 2009, a humid July night in the heart of the Midwest. I was driving down Route 56, a desolate stretch of highway that's sliced through miles of farmland and forgotten small towns. The road was infamous for accidents, ghost stories, and whispers of strange occurrences. But I was running late and had no choice. My sister had just given birth, and I was racing against time to make it to the hospital. The air in my car felt thick, oppressive even, as if something invisible weighed it down. My headlights barely pierced the inky darkness that engulfed the road, and my only companions were the rhythmic hum of my tires and the occasional rustle of wind against the cornfields. About 20 minutes into my drive, I saw something in the distance. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow flickering in and out of view. But as I drew closer, it became unmistakable. A woman stood on the shoulder of the road, her silhouette illuminated by my headlights. She wore a tattered white dress that fluttered unnaturally in the still air, and her long, dark hair obscured her face. She raised one pale hand, beckoning. I slowed down instinctively, a chill crawling up my spine. Something about her didn't feel right. Her posture was rigid, almost unnatural, and despite the warmth of the night, I felt a sudden wave of cold seep into the car. My gut told me to keep driving, but as I passed her, I couldn't help glancing in the rearview mirror. She was gone. My heart slammed against my ribs. I pressed harder on the gas, trying to shake the unease settling in my chest. Maybe she'd stepped into the cornfield or ducked behind the ditch. I told myself it didn't matter, that I'd made the right choice, not stopping. But the farther I drove, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. A strange noise interrupted my thoughts. A faint tapping sound, as though fingernails were drumming against glass. It was coming from the back window. I glanced in the mirror again, and my blood turned to ice. She was there, the same woman, clinging to the trunk of my car, her face now fully visible. Her eyes were black voids, and her mouth was twisted into a jagged, unnatural grin. I swerved instinctively, nearly running off the road. When I looked back again, she was gone. Panic surged through me as I tried to rationalize what had just happened. Was it exhaustion? A hallucination? Whatever it was, I needed to get off that highway. I searched for an exit, a sign, anything that would lead me to safety. But the road stretched on endlessly, a monotonous ribbon of asphalt flanked by endless fields. That's when I saw the headlights. At first, I was relieved. Another car, proof that I wasn't completely alone. But as the vehicle approached, my relief turned to dread. The headlights were erratic, weaving across the lanes as if the driver was drunk or worse. I honked my horn, flashing my high beams to warn them. The car didn't slow down, it sped up, heading straight for me. I swerved at the last second, my tires skidding on the gravel shoulder. The other car roared past, but something was wrong. Its windows were fogged up, and the interior was bathed in an eerie red light. I caught a glimpse of the driver, a man with sunken cheeks and hollow eyes, his mouth moving silently as if he were screaming. The car vanished into the night, leaving me shaking and drenched in sweat. I didn't have time to recover. My engine sputtered, then died. My car coasted to a stop on the shoulder of the road, and no amount of turning the key would bring it back to life. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of cornstalks in the breeze. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. This was the Midwest, and Route 56 was notorious for its dead zones. Swallowing my fear, I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car. The air outside was colder than it should have been, carrying a faint metallic smell that made my stomach churn. That's when I heard it, a soft, wet sound, like footsteps squelching through mud. I swung the flashlight around, my hands trembling. The beam landed on the cornfield, and for a moment I saw nothing. Then something moved. A shape emerged from the stalks, dragging itself toward me. It was her. Her dress was soaked, clinging to her thin frame as though she'd been pulled from a lake. Her hair hung in matted clumps, and her eyes... God, her eyes were worse than before. They weren't just voids, they were hungry, consuming everything in their gaze. She opened her mouth, and an inhuman wail erupted, freezing me in place. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I just ran down the road, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The sound of her wailing followed me, growing louder, closer. My legs burned and my lungs screamed for air, but I couldn't stop. Then I saw it, a gas station up ahead, its flickering neon sign like a beacon in the darkness. I stumbled inside, slamming the door behind me. The clerk, a wiry man in his 50s, looked up from his magazine with a raised eyebrow. "You okay there, son?" he asked. I tried to explain, but my words came out in a jumbled mess. He motioned for me to sit, handing me a bottle of water. As I caught my breath, I glanced out the window. The highway was empty. No woman, no car, nothing. "I saw her too," the clerk said suddenly, his voice low. "Years ago. Same stretch of road. Folks around here call her the Lady of the Highway. They say she was a hitchhiker killed by a drunk driver back in the 70s. Never got justice, so she wanders the road looking for revenge." I stared at him, my mind racing. "What happens if she catches you?" He shrugged, his expression grim. "Nobody knows. Nobody lives to tell." I didn't sleep that night, and I didn't drive home alone either. The clerk called a tow truck, and I hitched a ride back to town. I never drove that stretch of Route 56 again, and to this day I can't hear the sound of wind through cornfields without breaking into a cold sweat.
Story number 2.
It was late autumn, and I was driving through the dense woods of Pennsylvania on Route 217. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the world around me shrouded in darkness. My car's headlights carved narrow paths through the trees, illuminating little more than the road ahead and the occasional reflective eyes of deer in the distance. I had just wrapped up a business meeting in a nearby city and was on my way back to the small town where I was staying. This stretch of road was notorious for being isolated. No gas stations, no houses, just miles of towering pines and whispers of folklore about a figure they called the Roadkeeper. I'd laughed at the tales when a local bartender had told me about them earlier that week. He warned me not to linger on Route 217 after dark, but I'd brushed it off as small-town superstition. The first sign of trouble came when my radio began to crackle. I had been listening to a late-night call-in show, the kind where people shared their weirdest stories. Suddenly, static overtook the host's voice. I fiddled with the dial, but the noise only grew louder. Frustrated, I turned the radio off entirely. That's when I noticed something strange. The forest on either side of the road seemed darker, denser than before. My headlights felt swallowed by the night, their beams cutting through nothingness. It was as if the world had shifted, the trees growing closer together, the road narrowing with every mile. The silence was deafening. No wind, no insects, not even the rustle of leaves. A shadow darted across the road ahead, so fast I barely had time to register it. My heart jumped, and I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I scanned the road and the forest beyond, searching for whatever it was, an animal, a person, anything. But there was nothing, just the oppressive darkness and the faint outline of trees. I was about to press the gas pedal again when I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road about 50 yards ahead. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its arms hanging down longer than they should. The figure was draped in what looked like a tattered cloak, the edges of which seemed to blend into the shadows around it. Its head tilted slightly to one side, as though it were studying me. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice trembling as I rolled down the window. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" No response. The figure remained motionless. A wave of unease washed over me. Something about it didn't feel right. The way it stood there, so still, so quiet, it wasn't human. I don't know how I knew, but I just did. Panic clawed at my chest, and I decided to drive around it. I didn't care if it was real or a trick of my tired mind. I needed to get away. As I eased my car forward, the figure moved. It didn't walk or run. It glided, slipping silently across the road to block my path again. Its movements were smooth, fluid, and unnatural. My breath hitched, and I instinctively shifted into reverse, backing away. Then it started coming closer. Its movements quickened, a lurching glide that defied logic. The headlights caught glimpses of its face, or what should have been its face. There were no features, just a smooth, pale surface that reflected the light in an otherworldly way. My instincts screamed at me to run, and I threw the car into gear, flooring it. The tires screeched as I swerved past the figure, narrowly avoiding it. As I sped down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see it fading into the distance. But it was there. It was following me, and it wasn't running. It was keeping pace effortlessly. Its long arms stretched out, almost brushing the trunk of my car. I pushed the pedal to the floor, the engine roaring as I reached dangerous speeds. Still, it didn't fall behind. My phone, lying in the passenger seat, buzzed. I grabbed it with one hand, hoping against hope for a signal. The screen showed no bars, just a static-filled notification that read, "Turn around." Terror surged through me, and I tossed the phone aside. I couldn't turn around. Whatever was out there wanted me to stop, and I wasn't about to give it the satisfaction. The road began to twist and turn, my tires squealing as I navigated the sharp curves. Then everything stopped. I don't mean the car or the engine, I mean everything. The headlights dimmed, the dashboard lights flickered, and the world outside the car turned pitch black. The road, the trees, even the sky. All of it disappeared as though swallowed by a void. My car rolled to a gentle stop, and I sat there, paralyzed. The silence was suffocating. I reached for the door handle, like thinking maybe I could run, but as soon as my fingers touched it, I heard a voice. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the car, whispering directly into my ear. "You're not supposed to be here." The words were soft, but carried a weight that made my chest tighten. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles aching from the pressure. I tried to speak, to scream, but no sound came out. Suddenly, the darkness outside the car shifted. The figure was back, standing inches from my windshield. Its featureless face pressed against the glass, the smooth surface somehow expressing malice. It raised one impossibly long hand and tapped on the window, each sound echoing like a gunshot in the silence. I closed my eyes, praying it would go away. When I opened them again, I was back on the road. The car was moving, my speedometer showing a steady 60 miles per hour. The forest looked normal again, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it there, but there was nothing, just the empty road. By the time I reached the next town, my hands were still shaking. I pulled into a gas station, parked under the bright lights, and sat there for what felt like hours, trying to process what had happened. I couldn't explain it, and I didn't want to. I just knew I would never drive Route 217 at night again. The bartender's words echoed in my mind. The roadkeeper doesn't like trespassers. I've never told anyone this story before now. Maybe I don't want them to think I'm crazy, or maybe I'm afraid that talking about it will bring it back. All I know is, if you ever find yourself on Route 217, heed the locals' warnings, and whatever you do, don't stop.
Story number 3.
It was a cold November night, and I was driving through the Appalachian Mountains on my way to visit an old college friend. The trip was supposed to take about 5 hours, but I had left later than planned, and now I was winding through lonely back roads in the dead of night. The road was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I wasn't particularly nervous at first. I'd driven through the mountains plenty of times, and the dark, twisting roads were familiar. But as the hours dragged on, I began to feel uneasy. The road signs became less frequent, and my GPS had stopped working miles ago. I told myself it was nothing. Old roads in the mountains often lacked cell service, and my tank was still half full. I'd find my way eventually. That's when I saw the sign, Ravens Hollow, 15 miles. I didn't remember seeing any mention of Ravens Hollow on the map, but the name sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just the ominous sound of it, it was the way the sign looked. The letters were faded and cracked, as though the sign had been there for decades, untouched. I had no other options, though, so I kept driving. The further I went, the more unsettling the road became. The trees on either side of me grew denser, their branches stretching over the road like skeletal arms. My headlights barely cut through the thick darkness, and every shadow seemed to writhe with unseen movement. The air felt heavier, colder, even with the heater running. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a small gas station up ahead. Its single neon sign blinked erratically, spelling out gas in faded red letters. The building itself looked ancient, its paint peeling and windows fogged. Relief washed over me as I pulled in. I figured I could ask for directions or at least confirm I was on the right track. The attendant was an older man, hunched over behind the counter with a newspaper. He didn't look up as I entered. The air inside was stale, carrying a faint smell of mildew. I approached the counter and cleared my throat. "Excuse me," I said. "Can you tell me how far I am from the main highway?" The man slowly lowered his newspaper, revealing a gaunt face with sunken eyes. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I got turned around," I explained. "My GPS isn't working. I just need to know if I'm headed the right way." He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached beneath the counter and pulled out an old, tattered map. His bony finger traced a route through the mountains before stopping at a point marked with a small X. "You're here," he said. "If you keep going, you'll hit Raven's Hollow, but I wouldn't recommend it." "Why not?" I asked, trying to mask my growing unease. "Roads don't lead out of Raven's Hollow," he said cryptically. "Not the way you came, anyway." I felt a shiver run down my spine. Before I could ask him to explain, the lights in the gas station flickered, and for a brief moment everything went dark. When the lights came back on, the man was staring past me, his face pale. "You need to leave," he said, his voice trembling. "Now." I turned to look out the window and froze. A figure stood near my car. It was tall and impossibly thin, its body wrapped in what looked like tattered black fabric. Its head was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and piercing. "What is that?" I whispered. The man grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail. "Go! Don't stop! Don't look back!" I didn't need to be told twice. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as I climbed in. The figure didn't move, but I felt its presence bearing down on me. As soon as the engine roared to life, I sped out of the gas station and back onto the road. The darkness seemed thicker now, the trees closing in around me. My heart pounded as I glanced in the rearview mirror. At first, I saw nothing but the empty road behind me. Then the figure appeared, standing in the middle of the lane. Its head tilted slightly, as though it were studying me. I pressed the accelerator, my car lurching forward. The figure didn't follow, but the feeling of being watched never left. I kept driving, my knuckles white as I gripped the wheel. The road twisted and turned, and my headlights caught glimpses of things in the woods, shapes that didn't look like animals. Shadows moved in unnatural ways, darting between the trees and keeping pace with my car. And then the fog came. It rolled in thick and fast, swallowing the road and reducing my visibility to almost nothing. My headlights barely penetrated the mist, and I was forced to slow down. The feeling of unease grew into full-blown terror. I couldn't see where I was going, and every instinct told me to turn around. But the gas station attendant's words echoed in my mind. "Don't look back." The fog began to thin after what felt like an eternity, and I saw a faint light ahead. Relief surged through me as I realized it was the neon glow of a motel sign. I pulled into the parking lot and stumbled out of the car, my legs trembling. The motel looked old and run down, but it was a refuge. Inside, the desk clerk greeted me with a tired smile. I tried to explain what had happened, but she just shook her head. "You're lucky," she said. "Most people who see him don't make it out." "Who is he?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "They call him the Watcher," she said. "He guards Raven's Hollow, keeps outsiders from leaving once they've gone too far." I stayed at that motel until sunrise, too afraid to sleep. When I finally got back on the road, I followed the clerk's directions and avoided Raven's Hollow entirely. To this day, I don't know how close I came to being trapped there forever. But every now and then, when I drive through the mountains, I catch glimpses of shadows in the trees, and I wonder if the Watcher is still out there waiting for his next traveler.
Story number 4.
It was a clear September night, the kind where the stars seemed close enough to touch. I was driving through the endless desert highways of Nevada, heading back to Los Angeles after visiting family in Reno. The stretch of road I was on, known as Devil's Bend, had a reputation. Locals told stories of phantom hitchhikers, disappearing vehicles, and otherworldly lights. I had always dismissed it as urban legend, the kind of stuff people shared around campfires to spook each other. But that night, I would learn the truth. The desert around me was vast and empty, the sand and rocks illuminated by the pale glow of a full moon. My car's headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the endless asphalt ahead and the occasional scrub brush on the sides of the road. The radio was playing softly, a classic rock station I'd tuned into when my phone lost signal an hour earlier. I was about 30 miles from the nearest town when I saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road illuminated by my headlights. At first, I thought it was a mirage, a trick of the desert heat, but as I got closer, I realized it was a woman. She was wearing a flowing white dress that looked out of place in the harsh desert environment, and her hair was long and dark, hanging in thick waves around her face. I slowed the car, unsure of what to do. She didn't move, didn't even flinch as my car approached. Her head was tilted slightly downward, and her arms hung limply at her sides. Something about her posture made my stomach twist, but I rolled down the window anyway. "Are you okay?" I called out. She didn't respond. Her face was still obscured by her hair, but I could tell she was staring directly at me. The air around me suddenly felt colder. a sharp contrast to the dry heat of the desert night. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't just abandon her out there alone. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. She finally moved, lifting her head to look at me. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dark, bottomless pits that seemed to pull the light out of the world around them. My breath caught in my throat, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. Without saying a word, she turned and began walking away from the road, heading into the desert. I should have driven off right then and there, but curiosity got the better of me. I parked the car and grabbed my flashlight, stepping out into the cold night air. "Wait!" I called out. "Where are you going?" She didn't answer, didn't even look back. Her figure was barely visible now, a pale silhouette moving deeper into the desert. Against my better judgment, I followed her, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The further I went, the quieter the world became. The sound of the wind died away, and even the crunch of my boots on the sand seemed muffled. After what felt like an eternity, she stopped. She was standing in front of a large, jagged rock formation that jutted out of the desert floor like a broken tooth. The moonlight cast eerie shadows across the rocks, giving them the appearance of twisted faces. I approached cautiously, the flashlight shaking in my hand. "What's going on? Are you hurt?" She turned to face me, her expression unreadable. Then she pointed to the ground at her feet. I hesitated before shining the flashlight down, and my heart stopped. It was a shallow grave. The earth had been disturbed recently, the sand and rocks piled haphazardly over a dark, oblong shape. My mind raced as I tried to process what I was seeing. Before I could react, she began to speak, her voice soft and melodic, yet filled with an otherworldly echo. "They buried me here," she said. "Left me to rot in the desert, but I won't rest until they pay." My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about? Who did this to you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed back toward the highway. I turned to look, and that's when I saw the lights. Headlights, faint but growing brighter as a car approached from the distance. "You have to stop them," she said, her voice urgent now. "They're coming back." Before I could respond, she vanished. One moment she was standing there, and the next she was gone, leaving nothing but the disturbed earth of the grave behind. I stood frozen, my mind reeling, until the sound of the approaching car snapped me back to reality. I ran back to the highway, waving my arms and shining the flashlight to get the driver's attention. The car, an old pickup truck, slowed as it approached. There were two men inside, both wearing worn flannel shirts and baseball caps. The driver rolled down his window, his face weathered and suspicious. "What's the problem?" he asked. I hesitated, unsure of how to explain what I'd just seen. There's something out here, a grave. I think someone's been murdered." The men exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening. "You been out here long?" the passenger asked, his tone accusatory. "Just passing through," I said, taking a step back. Something about their demeanor put me on edge. I saw a woman on the side of the road. She led me to it. The driver's face darkened. "You didn't see anything," he said firmly. "Get back in your car and keep driving." My pulse quickened. "What are you talking about? She was right there," she said. Before I could finish, the air around us grew heavy, and a chilling wind swept across the desert. The headlights of their truck flickered, and the engine sputtered to a stop. The two men looked around, their bravado replaced by unease. And then she appeared. She materialized in the center of the road, her white dress glowing faintly in the moonlight. The men froze, their faces pale as she began to walk toward them. Her once soft voice now echoed with rage. "You thought you could leave me here," she said, her tone dripping with vengeance. "But I'll never let you go." The men scrambled out of the truck, backing away as she advanced. I stood frozen, unable to move as the wind howled around us. The desert seemed to come alive, the shadows stretching and twisting as if drawn to her. The last thing I saw before I fled was her reaching out toward them, her hands turning into claw-like shapes as she screamed. Their own cries were drowned out by the sound of the wind, and I didn't look back as I ran to my car and sped away. I never told anyone what happened that night, but I never drove through Devil's Bend again. To this day, I wonder if justice was served or if the desert claimed more souls that night.
Story number 5.
The night I drove through Black Hollow Road, I was on my way home from a wedding in a small town just outside of Savannah, Georgia. It was late, past midnight, and I was exhausted. The highway had been smooth and uneventful, but a wrong turn led me to a desolate, winding back road surrounded by dense woods. I figured it would connect me back to the main route eventually, so I didn't think much of it at first. The further I drove, the more unsettling the road became. The trees loomed tall on either side, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. My car's headlights illuminated the narrow path ahead, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness just beyond. The air felt thick, heavy, as though the forest itself was alive and watching. I hadn't seen another car for miles when I came across a sign that made my stomach drop. "Welcome to Black Hollow Road." The paint was peeling, and the sign looked ancient, almost like it belonged in a ghost town. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the creeping dread. It was just a road, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. But then the noises started. At first it was faint, a soft rustling in the woods, like leaves stirring in the wind. But there was no wind. The air outside was perfectly still. I rolled down the window to listen, and that's when I heard it. Faint whispers carried on the still air. They were too quiet to make out the words, but they sent a chill down my spine. It sounded like multiple voices, overlapping and disjointed. I rolled the window up quickly and pressed on the accelerator, eager to get off this cursed road. My heart pounded as the whispers grew louder, as if they were following me. I cranked up the radio to drown them out, but the static-filled station cut out entirely, leaving nothing but eerie silence. Then I saw her. She appeared out of nowhere, standing in the middle of the road about 50 feet ahead. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the asphalt as my car came to a halt. She was dressed in a long, tattered black dress that looked like it belonged to another century. Her hair was wild and unkempt, and her head hung low, obscuring her face. I honked the horn, hoping she would move, but she didn't budge. Instead, she slowly raised her head, and I caught a glimpse of her face. Her eyes were sunken, her skin pale and gray, like something pulled from the depths of a grave. Her lips moved as if she were speaking, but no sound came out. I reversed instinctively, my hands shaking as I fumbled to put the car into gear. But before I could, she was gone. One moment, she was standing there, and the next, the road was empty. I blinked, unsure if I'd imagined it, but the fear in my chest told me it was real. I hit the gas and sped forward, not caring if she reappeared. I just wanted to get away. The whispers were back now, louder and more distinct. They seemed to be coming from inside the car, surrounding me. "Turn back," one voice hissed. "Leave," another whispered, almost pleading. I gripped the wheel tightly, tears streaming down my face. "Leave me alone," I screamed, though I didn't know who or what I was talking to. Suddenly, my headlights flickered, plunging the road into darkness for a split second before they came back on. In that brief moment, I saw them, figures lining the sides of the road, their bodies barely visible in the shadows. They stood motionless, their faces blank and lifeless, but their eyes were fixed on me. I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. I floored the accelerator, my car roaring as I sped down the road. The figures didn't move, but I could feel their gaze burning into me, even as I left them behind. And then the laughter started. It was high-pitched and unnatural, like echoing through the car like a cruel mockery of my fear. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere at once. My rearview mirror showed nothing but the empty road behind me, but I felt a presence in the back seat, cold and oppressive. "Who's there?" I shouted, glancing over my shoulder. There was no one, but the laughter didn't stop. It grew louder, more menacing, as the air in the car grew colder. My breath fogged up the windshield, and my fingers went numb against the wheel. I couldn't see clearly, couldn't think. My only focus was on getting off Black Hollow Road. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw lights up ahead. A gas station, bright and inviting, like a beacon of hope. I veered into the parking lot, my tires screeching as I came to a stop. I stumbled out of the car, gasping for air, and ran inside. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a grizzled beard, looked up from his magazine as I burst through the door. His eyes narrowed as he took in my disheveled appearance. "You came from Black Hollow Road, didn't you?" he asked, his tone grim. I nodded, too shaken to speak. He sighed and shook his head. "You're lucky to be alive. Most people who take that road at night don't make it out. What is it?" I managed to stammer. He leaned against the counter, his expression somber. "They say it's cursed. Years ago, a whole village was wiped out back there. Fire, disease, who knows? No one's sure. But the spirits, they never left. They don't like visitors." I stared at him, my mind racing. Why didn't anyone warn me? "Some things," he said. "You have to learn the hard way." I didn't stay long. After filling up my tank and downing a cup of bitter coffee, I got back on the road, taking the clerk's directions to avoid Black Hollow Road entirely. The rest of the drive was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even now, years later, I can't forget that night. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I hear the whispers, faint but unmistakable, and every time I think about it, I wonder who or what was waiting for me in the darkness.
Story number 6.
It was the kind of night that wrapped the world in a suffocating silence, the sky thick with clouds that obscured the moon. I was driving alone through a remote stretch of Louisiana swamp roads, trying to get to my cousin's house for a late-night family gathering. The GPS had long since lost signal, leaving me to navigate the maze of winding roads and dense, overgrown trees by memory. The road seemed endless, snaking through the darkness with no sign of other cars or houses. My headlights barely cut through the mist rising from the swamp, giving the entire landscape an otherworldly glow. The only sound was the hum of my engine and the occasional croak of frogs hidden in the shadows. I checked the clock on the dashboard. 11:43 p.m. I told myself I was close, that I'd soon see the familiar turnoff that led to my cousin's place. But as the minutes dragged on, a knot of unease began to form in my stomach. Something about this road felt wrong. The trees seemed to close in tighter, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker at the edge of my vision, a faint light in the trees. I slowed the car, squinting into the darkness, but the light was gone. Shaking my head, I told myself it was nothing, maybe fireflies or some trick of the swamp gas. But then it appeared again, this time closer. A soft, flickering glow, like the flame of a lantern swaying gently in the breeze. It was on the side of the road, hovering between the gnarled roots of a massive cypress tree. My heart pounded as I drove past, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The light followed. It didn't move like a car or a flashlight. It glided, almost alive, darting between the trees as if it were toying with me. I pressed the accelerator, my car surging forward, but no matter how fast I went, the light kept pace. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Suddenly the light disappeared, plunging the road back into complete darkness. The relief was short-lived, though, as I rounded a curve and slammed on the brakes. My car skidded to a stop, the tires screeching against the cracked asphalt. There, in the middle of the road, stood a figure. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was dressed in ragged clothes, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. In his hand, he held an old-fashioned lantern, the same flickering light I'd seen moments ago. His head was tilted down, but I could feel his eyes on me, burning through the windshield. I honked the horn, the sound echoing through the empty swamp. The figure didn't move. My pulse raced as I stared at him, unsure of what to do. Every instinct told me to reverse, to get as far away from him as possible. But before I could react, he raised his arm and pointed down the road. I followed the gesture and froze. The swamp on either side of the road was filled with lights. Hundreds of them, all floating in the air like ghostly flames. They pulsed and flickered, casting an eerie glow over the twisted trees and stagnant water. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they weren't random. They were moving, forming a line that led deeper into the swamp. I turned back to the figure, but he was gone. The lantern he had held now rested on the ground, its flames still burning. I should have driven away. I should have turned the car around and never looked back. But something about the lights called to me. It wasn't curiosity. It was compulsion. Like a voice in my head whispering, "Follow." I got out of the car, the swamp air heavy and damp against my skin. The ground squelched under my boots as I stepped toward the lantern. I picked it up, the metal cool and smooth in my hand, and began to walk. The lights led me off the road and into the swamp, their glow reflecting in the dark, still water. The further I went, the quieter the world became. The frogs and insects had gone silent, leaving only the sound of my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. The air grew colder, the mist thicker, until I could barely see the ground in front of me. Then I saw the cabin. It was small and crooked, its wooden walls warped and covered in moss. The lights swirled around it like fireflies, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance across the swamp. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking softly as it swayed in the breeze. I should have turned back. Every part of me screamed to run, but my feet kept moving, drawn to the cabin like a moth to a flame. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was cold and damp, heavy with the scent of decay. The room was sparsely furnished, a table, a few chairs, and a stone fireplace filled with ash. But what caught my attention was the figure in the corner. It was a woman, her back to me, sitting in a rocking chair that swayed gently back and forth. Her long, tangled hair obscured her face, and her hands rested in her lap, clutching something I couldn't see. The lantern in my hand flickered as I stepped closer, the light casting long shadows across the room. "Ma'am?" I said, my voice trembling. "Are you okay?" She didn't respond. Slowly, I reached out, my fingers trembling as I touched her shoulder. She turned. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to pierce straight through me. She opened her mouth, and a low, guttural sound escaped, a sound that wasn't human. I stumbled back, dropping the lantern as the room erupted in light. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, growing larger and more menacing. The woman rose from the chair, her movements jerky and unnatural, as if controlled by invisible strings. The whispers were back, louder and more frantic, filling the cabin with a cacophony of voices. They seemed to come from the walls, the floor, even the very air around me. I turned and ran, the sound of the woman's uneven footsteps chasing me into the night. The swamp was alive now, the lights swirling and darting around me as if trying to block my path. I ran blindly, the lantern light long gone, until I tripped and fell onto the road. Scrambling to my feet, I saw my car just ahead, its headlights still on. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I jumped into the car, started the engine, and sped down the road as fast as I could. When I finally reached my cousin's house, I was shaking so badly I could barely speak. They laughed at first, chalking it up to exhaustion or an overactive imagination, but I knew what I had seen. To this day, I avoid that stretch of road, and sometimes late at night when I'm alone and the world is quiet, I hear the whispers again, faint but unmistakable.
Story number 7.
The night I agreed to house-a-sit for a family friend in the remote hills of West Virginia, I never imagined it would become the longest night of my life. The house was a massive old Victorian, sitting alone atop a hill surrounded by acres of dense forest. Its isolation had initially seemed like a peaceful retreat, but by the time I arrived, a heavy fog had rolled in and the house loomed like a dark silhouette against the pale gray sky. It started innocently enough. The homeowners had left detailed instructions. Feed the cat, water the plants, and make yourself at home. I unpacked my overnight bag, fixed a quick dinner, and then settled into the plush armchair in the living room, enjoying the crackling fire in the old stone hearth. By 9 p.m., the fog outside had thickened to the point where I couldn't see the driveway, let alone the woods beyond. The silence was unnerving. No cars, no distant hum of civilization, just the occasional groan of the house as it settled and the faint rustle of leaves outside. I distracted myself by scrolling on my phone, but when the signal dropped, my anxiety started to creep in. Around 10 p.m., the first strange sound broke the quiet. It was a soft tapping, like fingernails against glass. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The sound was faint but unmistakable, coming from the bay window in the living room. Slowly I turned toward it, expecting to see a branch or some animal, but there was nothing there. Just the fog pressing against the glass, dense and impenetrable. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the chill creeping through me. "Just the house," I muttered to myself. "Old houses make weird noises." Not 5 minutes later, the sound came again. This time, it was louder, sharper. It wasn't coming from the living room window. It was upstairs. I hesitated, my heart pounding as I stared at the dark staircase leading to the second floor. The logical part of my brain told me it was probably nothing, a draft, a loose shutter. But something deeper, more primal, told me to stay where I was. After a few minutes of silence, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to my phone. But the signal was still out, and the longer I sat there, the more I felt like I was being watched. The feeling was suffocating, like invisible eyes were on me, studying my every move. I decided to check on the cat, a fluffy orange tabby named Milo. I found him in the kitchen, crouched under the table, his fur bristling and his ears flat against his head. He hissed when I approached, his wide eyes fixed on something over my shoulder. I spun around, expecting to see someone or something behind me, but the kitchen was empty. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator. My pulse was racing now, and I scooped Milo up, carrying him back into the living room. He jumped from my arms and bolted upstairs, disappearing into the shadows. And that's when I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps above me. They weren't creaks or settling noises. They were footsteps, moving from one side of the house to the other. My mouth went dry as I stared up at the ceiling, the sound growing louder, closer. I grabbed the fireplace poker and crept toward the stairs, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I had to know. I had to see. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like an eternity, the old wood groaning beneath my weight. The hallway upstairs was dark, the only light coming from a single window at the far end, its glass fogged over. The footsteps had stopped, but the air was heavy with an oppressive stillness. I checked each room, one by one, finding nothing but furniture draped in white sheets and the faint smell of mildew. When I reached the last room, the master bedroom, I hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, and a cold draft seeped out, raising goosebumps on my skin. I pushed the door open with the poker, my hands trembling. The room was empty, but the window was wide open, the fog outside spilling in like a living thing. I crossed the room to close it, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, wet prints on the wooden floor leading from the window to the bed. They weren't mine. They were too large and they were barefoot. My stomach dropped as I realized they weren't just leading to the bed. They were circling it, over and over, like someone or something had been pacing. I backed away, the poker clutched tightly in my hands, and slammed the window shut. That's when I heard Milo again, his loud, desperate yowls echoing from downstairs. I sprinted back down, my fear now overtaken by the need to protect the poor cat. I found him in the living room, his back arched and his fur standing on end as he hissed at the bay window. And that's when I saw it. There was a figure standing just outside the glass, barely visible through the fog. It was tall and thin, its outline blurred but unmistakably human. My breath caught as it raised a hand and pressed it against the window, leaving a smear of dark, wet streaks. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. The figure didn't move, didn't try to enter. It just stood there, watching me. Then, slowly, it tilted its head as if curious. I grabbed my car keys and bolted for the front door, scooping up Milo on the way. The figure didn't follow, but I could feel its gaze burning into my back as I threw open the door and ran to my car. The drive down the hill was a blur. The fog seemed to cling to the car, the headlights barely piercing the darkness. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station, the fluorescent lights a stark contrast to the nightmare I'd just escaped. I called the homeowners the next morning, telling them I couldn't stay another night. They seemed understanding, almost too understanding, as if they'd heard it all before. When I mentioned the figure, there was a long silence before the husband spoke. "Don't go back," he said, his voice low. "We've seen it too. Whatever it is, it doesn't like visitors." I haven't been back to that house, and I never plan to, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps in my mind, and I wonder if the figure is still there, waiting for the next unlucky soul.
Story number 8.
It all started with a harmless weekend getaway. My friends and I decided to escape the city and rent a cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The place was gorgeous. A rustic two-story cabin nestled in a secluded valley surrounded by towering trees. It was the perfect retreat for hiking, drinking, and forgetting about work for a few days. The first day went off without a hitch. We explored the trails, laughed over beers by the fire, and marveled at the quiet isolation. By nightfall, the stars lit up the sky like 1,000 tiny lanterns, and the woods hummed with the sounds of nature. But by the second night, the mood had shifted. It started with a sound. Around midnight, we were sitting in the living room playing cards when we heard a distant noise, like a low, guttural moan. At first, we thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but it didn't sound quite right. It was too deliberate, too human. Probably just the wind, my friend Jamie said, though his voice betrayed his unease. The sound came again, closer this time, and we all froze. It echoed through the trees, a mournful wail that seemed to stretch on forever. We exchanged nervous glances, but no one wanted to admit they were scared. "Let's just lock the doors and call it a night," Sarah suggested. We agreed, bolting the doors and windows before retreating to our respective rooms. I had trouble sleeping. The cabin was old, and every creak of the wooden floorboards or gust of wind outside made me jump. Around 3 a.m., just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again, the moaning, louder and more insistent. It sounded like it was right outside my window. I sat up, my heart pounding. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of the trees beyond the glass. Gathering my courage, I crept to the window and peeked out. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the pale moonlight. It was tall and gaunt, its body draped in tattered clothing. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its posture was unnatural, almost hunched. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, heavy and oppressive. I stumbled back from the window, my chest tight with fear. I wanted to scream, to wake the others, but something about the figure kept me silent. It was like it was daring me to make a sound, to acknowledge its existence. The next morning, I told the group what I'd seen. Jamie laughed it off, saying it was probably my imagination or a trick of the light. But Sarah looked pale, her hands trembling as she sipped her coffee. I heard it too, she said quietly. The moaning. It woke me up. We decided to cut the trip short and leave that afternoon. But as we packed up, the forest seemed to close in around us. The once beautiful trees now felt menacing, their twisted branches like skeletal hands reaching for the cabin. As we loaded the car, Sarah gasped and pointed toward the tree line. Look, she whispered. There were footprints in the dirt. Bare footprints, impossibly large and leading from the forest to the cabin. They stopped abruptly just a few feet from the porch, as if whoever or whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. Jamie cursed under his breath and threw our bags into the trunk. Let's just get the hell out of here, he muttered. The drive down the mountain was tense. The winding road seemed narrower, the fog thicker, as if the forest was trying to keep us from leaving. No one spoke, the silence in the car oppressive. Then, halfway down the mountain, the car suddenly jerked to a stop. Jamie swore, slamming on the brakes as the engine sputtered and died. What's wrong? I asked, my voice shaking. I don't know, he said, turning the key. The engine wouldn't start. He popped the hood and got out to check, leaving Sarah and me alone in the car. That's when we saw it. The figure was back, standing in the middle of the road about 50 feet ahead. It was closer now, and I could make out more details. Its skin was ashen, almost translucent, and its eyes were hollow black pits that seemed to suck in the light. It didn't move, but its presence filled the air with a suffocating weight. Sarah grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. Do you see it? She whispered. Yes, I breathed. I see it. Jamie slammed the hood shut and climbed back into the car. I can't figure it out. He stopped mid-sentence when he saw our faces, then followed our gaze to the figure. What the? He began, but before he could finish, the figure raised an arm and pointed toward us. It wasn't a normal gesture. It was jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. The air grew colder, and the forest around us went silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just the figure and the oppressive, crushing quiet. Start the car, Sarah screamed. Jamie frantically turned the key, and miraculously the engine roared to life. He floored the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward, the figure disappearing into the fog as we sped past. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, an hour away. None of us could explain what we'd seen, and the locals were tight-lipped when we asked about the area. An older man at the gas station shook his head and muttered something about the Hollow Man, but he wouldn't elaborate. To this day, I can't drive through a wooded area without feeling a sense of dread. I still hear that moaning sometimes late at night, and I see the figure in my dreams, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching.